Yes, good evening. My name is Wallace Gator Bradley, and I'm the host of the Bradley Report. I'm also the president of United Peace, Inc. We got a very interesting story of historical proportions, culturally speaking, for America in particular, but especially for the African American community. This Saturday, August 26th, will be the 60th year anniversary of the March on Washington. We're going to talk about how it was 60 years ago. You're going to hear people discuss what they had got 60 years ago behind the March on Washington, the civil rights that they have received, and we paying attention now that we're losing those rights. We got an African-American woman that's the vice president of the United States. She's gonna speak about it. This show was put together and produced by none other than the chairman of United Peace, Inc., my wife, Terry Marsh Bradley. It's incumbent on us to help educate our young adults to the importance of knowing your history, especially when you have the ultra-right trying to erase our history. We'll talk about that next week. But without further ado, I want to say to God be the glory. That's my story. Let's make it happen.
It strengthens the people. It protects and fights for fundamental freedoms, individual rights. It's a fight for order against chaos. It strengthens. On the other hand, democracy, incredibly fragile. It will only be as strong as our willingness to fight for it. And right now, there are many forces that are attempting to purposely, I believe, weaken our democracy.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris speaking on the fate of our democracy. She sat down with the Reverend Al Sharpton, who'll join us in just a moment to discuss the ongoing fight for racial justice and equality. This past Friday marked the third anniversary of President Biden selecting Harris as his running mate. And you wouldn't know it from her relentlessly negative press coverage, but ever since then, she's been Biden's political secret weapon, particularly the last year and a half on social and cultural issues such as abortion. As the New York Times notes, Harris has taken on a new forceful role in the Biden-Harris re-elect. Joining me now, Molly Jong-Fast, special correspondent for Vanity Fair and host of the Fast Politics podcast, and the Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, founder and president of the National Action Network, and author of Righteous Troublemakers, Untold Stories of the Social Justice Movement in America. Rev, you got the interview, so I'm starting with you. What were your biggest takeaways from your sit-down with the vice president?
My biggest takeaways, I wanted to talk with her, and it was a long interview. We showed half of it last night on Politics Nation. We'll show the other half 2 weeks from now, the day of the March on Washington. I wanted to sit with her to talk about 60 years after the March on Washington of Dr. King, I Have a Dream. How does she see where we are now as we get ready, Martin King III, Andre Waters King, and I leading this march Saturday after next? And she said she's fearing about democracy. We've seen in our lifetime the erosion of many of the rights that we had 60 years ago. Waters King talks about how her daughter, the only grandchild of Martin Luther King, has less rights growing up than we had. Women's right to choose is gone. The right to vote is being eroded in many states. Hate crimes are up for blacks, gays, and Jews. So that's why we're having this march. I wanted to talk to her about it. And I was struck up, because I've known the vice president a long time, at the passion and the real commitment that she had to really fighting this back. She said, this is not just about an election. It's about whether we're going to have a democracy or an autocracy. If they get away with lessening our vote and weakening our vote, then we are in an autocratic state and we lose.
And Rev, as you just mentioned, you spoke to her about the march. You've got your T-shirt there, the 60th March anniversary of the March on Washington.
I've got one for you.
Oh, good. I'll take it in a small. I'll be aspirational. But how did the March on Washington, that moment in history, make her rise possible?
I think that when you saw tens of thousands of people in Washington, of all labor, blacks, one of the great rabbis made one of the great speeches that day. And of course, Dr. King with I Have a Dream and the leading civil rights group. That said to the Congress that, wait a minute, there's a mass following here. There's going to be problems in my own state in terms of my vote. You got to show marching doesn't solve a problem. It dramatizes the problem to make people do something. And don't forget that impact helped to energize 63. We got the 64 Civil Rights Act and then the 65 Voting Rights Act. If you can't show mass support, people in the Congress and the Senate will not do anything because they do not see the threat.
Right, and that's an excellent point, Rev. Marching only does one part of the process. Molly, you and I, what is that? 6 months ago now, had separate interviews with the vice president on the same day in the same office where Rev did his interview. And I bring that up to get your perspective between then and now, because we've seen the vice president really in action. She flew to Florida and sparred with Governor DeSantis over Florida's new curriculum on slavery. She also flew to Iowa to defend abortion rights. Talk about how important her role is to the Biden ticket.
So she has been everywhere. She's been to Florida about the African American AP courses. She was there also before about abortion. I mean, she has been quick to jump on a plane and give a very passionate and very good speech. And I think she's been amazing. And I think that the reason that she has had such a tough time is because there is so much racism and so much sexism, and it's so pervasive and it's so baked in to our mainstream media and to our society as a whole that she cannot get a fair shake. And I really think that you see, even in the framing, even when people think they are giving her the benefit of the doubt, they are not. And you see this, and you see this as a problem that a lot of women and a lot of women of color who are in politics have, and it's incredibly unfair, and it's what keeps a lot of women from running, and it's just it's like one of the great tragedies of our modern time.
Well, Molly, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I was about to ask you, I'm just wondering, do you think Vice President Harris is being unfairly criticized because she's the first woman and first woman of color in the role of vice president?
Yes, and I think that women of color have it 10 times harder than anyone else. I think that the coverage they get is uniquely unfair. I think that even when journalists think they are being unbiased, they have a bias that is so innate and hard to parse that it affects the coverage even when they think it doesn't. I think that there's so much racism and sexism in our culture, and it's so baked in, and it's so hard for people to see that even people who think they're not doing it and who think they are, not biased, they have that problem. And you see it again and again. And look at Black women politicians have absolutely the hardest time. And, if you think about how few Black senators we've had and how few Black women senators we've had, and if you look at the House, I mean, it's just the treatment is different, the writing is different, the titles are different, the framing is different. It's just such a pervasive problem, and it's so hard to parse, and I think it is really terrible.
Molly Jong-Fast and Reverend Al Sharpton, more of your interview will air around the time of the march. Thank you both with the interview with the Vice President. Thank you both very much for coming to the Sunday Show.
The wonderful thing by watching Jonathan Jonathan on that show doing the interview, and then watching them interview Al Sharpton, and they talking about the importance of an African-American woman fighting for democracy is tantamount within itself. That's why when my wife said, "Hey, boo, let's do this show about her," so I want to publicly say, Terry Marsh Bradley, everybody know you the boss, and I just do what I do. Let's make it do what it do. Let's hit that next show, next story.
We're just days away from another historic March on Washington. It will begin at the Lincoln Memorial on Saturday.
This time, the call is to continue Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s work from 60 years ago.
That's right. Eleanor Holmes Norton was there in 1963. She had a pivotal role in the planning of that march on Washington.
Tonight, our Larry Miller revisits that time in history with Delegate Norton.
I got word that the March on Washington was being organized and that I could help. And so I flew to New York to help organize the March on Washington for part of that same summer. Bayard Rustin was the organizer of the March on Washington. I'm a mignon in this. He may have been the only person, black or white, who could have organized a mammoth March on Washington. Though we did not know for sure. We knew many buses we had organized. We'd organized people come from trains. But would they come, and what would they do when they got there? I flew from New York to Washington. And flying over and looking out the window, I knew that the march would be an extraordinary success because I could see people lining up early in the morning all over Washington, raring to go. That was a sight to behold. We weren't just marching. Out of it came the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, exquisitely important, and ultimately the 1968 Fair Housing Act. I'm in this book with people like Angela Davis.
And like the title of the book, she still dreams of a more just world. But now for her, the fight is in the halls of Congress, advocating for district residents she represents. The years on the battlefield for equality have taught her that today's activists must be focused and steadfast.
The Montgomery bus boycott, in a real sense, was a precipitating event for the civil rights movement. The killing of George Floyd was a precipitating event for the movement we see now. You do not get change in this country. It's too diverse, it's too big, unless you work hard for it.
The wonderful thing when I see this, I've lived through this. I know the people personally that's speaking about this now. And I tell all the young adults from where I came from the streets, the first time I got locked up, I had just entered high school with Morgan Park. And Martin Luther King had got assassinated. And everybody was rioting. They didn't like hate was in the air. We didn't like white individuals, and we didn't like nobody that was against Martin. And I ended up going to jail for mob action. So when I see these young adults today, letting someone call them and TikTok them to go jump on people's cars, twerking and running down town interrupting the Bubbling Day parade, know that you're committing a crime. But let us get on with this history. That's what this is all about.
100 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves, 200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights.
Well, I was standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and I must say that the notion that I could look from those steps and not see the end of the crowd was the most extraordinary experience of my lifetime. Because nothing can quite overwhelm what was then the largest march that had ever been seen in Washington. 250,000 people came to that march. Martin Luther King's speech drowned out. It was so eloquent because he reiterated that time, I have a dream this, I have a dream that. So that's why the I have a dream speech is still remembered to this day. I must say that when I saw all those people come, I believed that legislation would come out of it. It would have been very hard for Congress to ignore 250,000 people coming from all over the country, from every member's district. And sure enough, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, and ultimately the 68 Fair Housing Act came out of that one march. Unlike the period of the March on Washington, we have a very polarized Congress, which makes it difficult to get any legislation passed. They have, for example, hammered on the District of Columbia, which I represent. So unlike the kind of atmosphere we had during the March on Washington, we have exactly the opposite now. What I'd like to see come out of the march again as we commemorate it is a reflection on what we can do when all sides work together to get something important done. I'd like to see a break in the polarization in the Congress itself.
What is happening now in Washington, D.C., with the Republicans being in charge of the House and Congress? They trying to push a law or create a law that would take the rights from Washington, D.C., where that woman would no longer be the congressman. They try to take the rights away from the mayor of Washington, D.C. I'm saying that to tell you now, African Americans, all that sense is violent shootings and killings, disrespecting our elders and seniors, abusing women and children. We got to be about community law because they are destroying us as a people. Make no mistake about it. Whoever's behind them doing it, they got a reason for them to do it, for them to erase this history. This is purposeful, what I'm sharing with you.
The things that Dr. King left in this world that they tried to erase, the speeches that he made, the fearlessness of life that he presented as was so important.
A moving tribute to 60 years since the March on Washington. Medgar Evers was killed just months before the March on Washington, and Dr. King delivered some of the most prolific words that are known in history. Part of that March on Washington Street speech was, I have a dream. And so I'm standing here with Dr. Yusef Salaam.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
From 60 years ago to today, and now, you know, what you've gone through, and now being a politician for Harlem.
Yeah.
Talk to me about this moment for you.
Man, you know, Dr. King was regulated to the dream. But the things that Dr. King left in this world that they tried to erase, the speeches that he made, the fearlessness of life that he presented as was so important. And to be able to carry the torch forward, to be able to say, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams, Wow, I'm just looking at Dr. King, I'm looking at Medgar Evers, I'm looking at Emmett Till. I'm looking at all of the people whose lives were stolen because of white supremacy, white male dominance. This thing that is still alive and sick in America that we have to fight against.
White male dominance almost took your life.
Absolutely, absolutely. Still wants to take my life. I'm not shy to say that because I know what's at stake. But I know that we have to live fearlessly in order to make sure, in fact, that the future is alive and well for all that we do.
He was one of the individuals that Trump tried to get or felt like he should have been hung for a crime that he didn't commit with 3 or 4 other brothers. They did time in the penitentiary for a crime that they didn't commit in Central Park. Supposed to have been a rape and a murder of a white woman. He didn't do it. By the grace of God, they end up getting out because of prosecutorial misconduct and wrongful convictions. Now he's an alderman in Harlem. I know what that means because I too was an ex-felon. I'm standing on the morals of individuals like Martin Luther King, Reverend Jackson, Minister Farrakhan, my father, Wallace Bradley, Jerry Butler. I can go on and on and on. That'll be another show. I just want to say this because I got to cut it off. Know your history. Know why we constantly fight. We not immigrants. They brought us over here. But we are Americans because we helped build this country. March 19th, 2024, please get out and vote in the Democratic primary. Make no difference who you vote for in that Democratic primary. Get out and vote. Because in November 2024, make sure you vote Democrat so we can stop this madness, and that'll help save the lives of our children. To God be the glory. That's Gator Story.